Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Welcome back to another It's Chapter 10 video. We're talking here about neuromuscular junction. We can abbreviate this as NMJ. This is basically talking about the synapse between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber. And of course, chapter 10 is focusing on skeletal muscle tissue, but your neuromuscular junction can be used to talk about the motor neuron synapsing onto cardiac muscle or smooth muscle. When we talk about the skeletal muscle, it's important that we pay attention to the motor neuron can be either in the brain stem or spinal cord. So what we're talking about is a motor neuron that has its cell body located in what we can call the central nervous system. And it's extending out through nerves. And it's synapsing onto skeletal muscle fiber. Remember, our skeletal muscle fiber is going to be cylindrical in shape. It's going to have those striations, which is the pattern showing up from the combination of the thick and the thin filaments of the sarcomere unit. That was our previous video. And remember, your skeletal muscle is multinucleated, so we might see multiple nuclei. So we have a picture here, really basic drawing of our central nervous system showing the brainstem, spinal cord. And then we have a motor neuron coming from the brainstem and spinal cord. So part of the cell is located there. And then part of the cell is extending out into what would be the nerve. And then synapsing onto our skeletal muscle fiber, which remember is just another way for us to think about the cell. And this place where the synapse is happening is what is called that neuromuscular junction, or NMJ. Now it's important to see that the end of the neuron has this little enlarged area, which we call synaptic knob. And I actually drew 3 different synaptic knobs, and I just have one close to that skeletal muscle. And if you notice in my drawing, I left a space in between that synaptic knob and the muscle fiber. And that space that we see there is called the synaptic cleft. So when we're talking about our NMJ, neuromuscular junction, the synaptic knob of the neuron, shown in yellow, is close to the skeletal muscle fiber. So this is actually, remember, our sarcolemma. And what we'll see is that as we get to this area of synapse, the sarcolemma will actually have a lot of grooves to it, a lot of folding, I should say folding. And that area of folding, we're going to call the motor end plate. So when we're looking at the sarcolemma, which is the cell membrane of the skeletal muscle, we have a special region called the motor end plate, which has a lot of folding. And this is the skeletal muscle fiber component of the neuromuscular junction. And again, the synaptic knob and the sarcolemma, that motor end plate, actually don't physically touch each other. There's a small space there called the synaptic cleft. And one of the things that's important to pay attention to here is we are going to see that you have a neuron synapsing onto a skeletal muscle, but we don't see that every skeletal muscle has its very own neuron. Instead, what we'll see is these neurons can have extensions that then go to, a different muscle fiber. So as we're thinking about this relationship, we'll see that the same neuron can control more than one muscle fiber. So that'll be important to pay attention to. And our diagram from our textbook, let's take a look at that one next. In this case, we're seeing right here at the top, we have our axon. So this is our extension. If we draw like our cell body and then draw our axon connecting in, so we would have, just a minute. So in this drawing, we could draw in our central nervous system, which is the brainstem or spinal cord. We can again show the motor neuron cell body to be located in the nervous system, in the central nervous system. We can see the axon extending out. And then here we see that axon is synapsing here on the muscle fiber. So this is a diagram showing us the drawing that I made for you, hopefully you made for yourself in your notes just a few minutes ago. The thing that we can pick up on in this particular picture is when we're looking in that synaptic knob, so that's the enlarged end of the axon, it's got vesicles. And remember, a vesicle, he's talking about a membrane packaged structure. And inside the vesicle, we see these little red dots, which are representing what's called acetylcholine. And here we see our abbreviation for acetylcholine is big A, big C, little h. The acetylcholine is our neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that are released from the neuron to whatever cell it's synapsing onto. In that case here, we're synapsing onto a skeletal muscle cell, but it could be cardiac muscle, could be smooth muscle, could be another neuron, it could be a gland. And so the neurotransmitter is that chemical messenger that's released at a synapse that would be different from a hormone, which remember is released through the bloodstream. Notice you're seeing your motor end plate on your skeletal muscle fiber. So this second cell here is the skeletal muscle fiber. Remember, muscle fiber here is our new way of saying cell. And then of course, up at the top, we're seeing that enlarged end of the neuron, which is called the synaptic knob. And we're seeing our space, the synaptic cleft, which is that space in between the synaptic knob and the motor end plate. The folding that we see in the motor end plate is important because it's going to increase what we call surface area. So what we're going to actually see is that neurotransmitter is going to come across and it's going to bind. And here we see an even more close-up picture of that. So we're able to see our synaptic knob. We're able to see those vesicles full of the acetylcholine neurotransmitter. We're able to see that this acetylcholine will be released. Notice the process of release is called exocytosis. So that's where you have a vesicle fuse with the membrane in order for material to leave. We can see here our synaptic cleft, so our space in between these two cells. We see this highly folded up sarcolemma, which is our motor end plate. So we can label this cell here again, our skeletal muscle fiber. And again, the motor end plate is this special folded part of the sarcolemma. But notice here we have this acetylcholine receptor, and we're going to call this a few things. We can call it a chemically gated sodium channel. Chemically gated sodium channel, or we can call it a nicotinic receptor. And here our book calls it acetylcholine receptor. So essentially what we see happening here is the acetylcholine will bind to this receptor that opens up the receptor. It's a protein channel. And so it's a protein channel that only allows sodium to move through. Remember, we talked about having gated channels in chapter 3, and we said, you know, the idea of having a gate means you can like open and close the gate. And so what we see is like the key to open and close the gate would be the acetylcholine. So acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter, binds that opens the protein channel, and the sodium ion can move into the muscle fiber. So again, we're going to call this channel a chemically gated sodium channel this semester, and then we'll talk about this next semester as being a nicotinic receptor. And in our text, we see it listed here as acetylcholine receptor. So any of these names are correct and can be used for this particular area. Right now, the emphasis that I'd like for you to have is really a good kind of mental image of this location, this neuromuscular junction. And we're going to go through the steps of what's happening here. We're going to see this diagram again in the future. To kind of wrap up our conversation here in this particular video, we have what's called the excitation-contraction coupling. And so what we're seeing here is in order for the skeletal muscle to contract, first what we see happening is that the cell membrane has to be excited. So we could even say, instead of cell membrane, we could say sarcolemma. And instead of excited, we could say, let's say gets an action potential. Now we've thrown out this term before, action potential. Action potential is talking about a nerve impulse. So we've mentioned that the sarcolemma is an excitable membrane, and the significance of that is that it can generate and propagate an action potential. And what we see here is that the sarcolemma is getting an action potential. Let's just go ahead and add from the motor neuron. So you actually remember skeletal muscle is being controlled specifically by the nervous system. So we have to get the signal coming from the nervous system. And then the second important thing that we see happening here is that the action potential that we've just mentioning is going to be coupled to the actual contraction of the muscle fiber through the release of the calcium ion, which is stored, remember, in the SR, which is our abbreviation for sarcoplasmic reticulum. So excitation-contraction coupling is telling us that the skeletal muscle fiber has to first get an action potential from the nervous system. And then ultimately, that signal is going to cause a release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that's going to trigger the contraction. So the coupling here is talking about that exact connection. Okay, so let's look at those steps in a little bit more detail in our next video. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.